awfully good question you asked. And she said, well, yes. She said, I'm getting ready for an exam. I said, oh, what are you doing? She says, well, I'm doing an exam next week in education. Another person said the same thing about an exam he just had in psychology. And a third person said, we're using the book also in economics. And your chapter on Vietnam is the only place we can find that tells us really why we were in Vietnam and who made the money out of it and so forth. And so it was used at Wisconsin, for example, at Madison, in 3 different disciplines.
That's something.
So I'm pleased about that. Sure.
How's that feel, though? Well, you did, of course, you didn't know at the time the choice came out, but you didn't know it was going to have this kind of impact. How does it feel
Well, actually,
now?
I did.
Oh, you did?
Well, yes, I knew. Well, in fact, I was reasonably clear on its impact because I had gone on. I had even calculated the date on which I would be fired.
Oh,
and I was fired on that date. I had gone so far. I had gone so far as to hire a hall for my press conference. I had my press releases done. I had hired a PR guy to handle it.
And you were right?
Oh, I was exactly right. I was exactly right.
How'd you know?
They fired me on that. Well, here again, it is being willing to see what you're looking at. And I don't want to be unfair to them, but I have not encountered in all of my living, whether it was in the war, in the Korean War, or any of these places, in the South, my home state gave birth to the Ku Klux Klan, the state of Tennessee. But I have never encountered a more clearly racist person than the bureau chief at Newsweek in Washington at that time. He was so racist, so I could calculate him, and I did.
And use it to your advantage.
Of course. In fact, I had already signed at the same story in the Washington Post that announced my firing, announced that I was going to be a professor at Howard University in journalism because I'd already signed at Howard. I was so clear that I would be fired on that date until I had signed to go to work the next day at Howard.
And you did that?
And did so.
Okay.
So that's how easily they were calculated because it was so
predictable,
absolutely, abjectly racist. Yes. Yes.
Now, your next book is a book you've done in the March, the 63 March.
The 63 and 83 March. It's a book of has 150 color photographs and 10 black and white photographs with one of my 2 sons, Frederick Walton yet, who's a lawyer, but he was up at Harvard Law at the time, but he came down and helped me photograph the 83 March. So we did every photograph in there.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, that we failed to mention that you're also a photographer. And
well, yes, I did.
For many years.
Well, I did have the good experience of working with Gordon Parks, a great, truly great photographer
and writer.
And Renaissance man. He's an absolutely wonderful Renaissance man.
There's an exhibit going on at this time.
At the Corcoran in Washington. It's an absolutely wonderful exhibit. And in fact, if one puts on the earphones and goes around and listens, he does point out that I worked with him on the series Life magazine. Before I went to the Afro-American, I did a series with Life magazine with Gordon in 1956. It was a 4-part series on racial segregation in the United States. And he does point out that this series we did out of Alabama, that I had worked with him on that, and that was really, it's a story within itself. And Gordon does a terrific job at the Corcoran in explaining that.
What does it take to be a good photographer?
Well, my son, my older son, who helped work on this, he says, mainly luck. He says, first of all, he says, look at the things you have to look at. First of all, it was luck that you were at the place to get the picture you wanted. It was luck that you had your camera with you. It was properly loaded, and it happened so quickly. He said a lot of it is luck. I say...
good eye?
Good eye, no question. Now, that's my younger son, who's an architect. He helped with designing that particular book. But he says, you know, it's what you see, and they're both correct. I did a piece, I was asked to do a piece for one of the photography magazines, and I said in that magazine that the thing that helps you make money in the business, though, is exclusivity. Be where nobody else is. Be there when the thing happens.
You're the only one who has it.
Well, if you're the only one there. For example, I was in Beirut, Lebanon, when the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1979 went in and met with Yasser Arafat in hopes of getting Yasser Arafat and the Jews to do what eventually they have done, sign some agreements at the White House, although they're not being carried out well, particularly by the Jews. But they did meet with Yasser Arafat, and I was the only journalist who was allowed inside that session.
How'd you get in?
Well, I had covered the organization meeting of the SCLC.
Okay.
And when they went there to do this, they envisioned Nobel Peace Prizes and all these other things, as well as a great service to mankind if they had been able to settle that matter. So they decided they wanted it recorded and said that they were going to take one journalist on and asked me if I would go. They asked me on a Friday, and they were leaving on Sunday. But my wonderful wife, would allow me to do this sort of thing, so I took off with them on two conditions. I said, on two conditions, I will go. They said, what is it? I said, first is that you will let me see everything. You will not at some point decide that I can't see.
Yeah.
And they said, yeah, okay, we'll do that. And I said, the other is that you'll let me pay my own way. Well, we had no problem with that. But you say, well, why? Why did you insist on paying your own way? Because I didn't want anybody to tell me what I saw. I wanted to see.
That's
I
true.
wanted to see, and I didn't want anybody to say, okay, we paid your way, and here's what you. So no. So
Right. No strings attached.
So right. So I wound up. You had all these reporters out there in the street who wanted to get in there, but I had made an agreement with them. And at one point, one of the two fellows wanted to back out on the promise, and I held the other one to it. And I got in. It was one of the most fantastic 4 hours of my life with Yasser Arafat and members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. At the end of the 4 hours, Yasser Arafat wound up standing in the middle of these delegates from the SCLC with their arms folded, singing "We Shall Overcome." And he did, in fact, agree to go and try to agree in 1979 with the with Israel to get them to do what now they have agreed essentially to do, even though they don't carry it out at the White House.
At least in words.
Right. But it was truly a fantastic 4 hours. But my photograph in there, now the one photograph that's carried in here, one of the photographs carried in here on that, People magazine bought for enough to pay for my trip, actually. and part of that was out of the fact that I was the only person in there with it. And here you see this photograph.
Oh, wow.
With Yasser Arafat in the center, singing "We Shall Overcome" with Dr. Joseph Lowery, the currently outgoing president, who has been president of the SCLC, Walter Fauntleroy, who was one of the delegates, and a fellow named Sampson and Bernard Lee. These were all persons who had been in the movement with Dr. King and so forth. And so that photograph alone, because it was exclusive, nobody else had it. I had it. And
they called for permission.
It practically paid for my trip, you see. So exclusivity, I say, is important.
And sometimes you have to be willing to take a chance, if you will.
Well, there's no question about that. But also, when it all comes down to it, the quality of the photograph is important. For example, I went. The Chinese in 1977 were looking forward to normalization of relations with the United States, as the United States was looking forward to it with China.
Yes.
And Americans had not been allowed to go into China in a general way. Certainly journalists had not since 1952.
Yes, sir.
Except when they went with Nixon in 1971. But in 1977, the Chinese invited what they regarded as a small group of distinguished American journalists to come, and Carl Rowan, a syndicated columnist, and a fellow Tennessean, invited me to go with him once he got permission to go, and Lewis Martin of the Chicago Defender, Joe Albritton, who then owned the Washington Star, and another fellow who was a medical writer. We went in there, and my photograph of the Great Wall of China wound up being the premium photograph,
that was
poster
used
for the World's Fair in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1982 in the China Pavilion. They bought 10,000 posters from me.
Well, I guess another part of that is being in the right place at the right time, too.
Well, but as the fellow who ran the pavilion, when I approached the guy in New York and said, I have a great photograph of the Great Wall of China.
You need to see it.
He said, look, I've seen a million photographs of the Great Wall of China. I'm from China. I said, yeah, but you ought to see mine. So he came to Washington for something else, and I went down and met with him, and he looked at it for 5 minutes without stopping, and he finally said, yes, we'll buy this.
Really?
And so we did 10,000 posters for them for the World's Fair at their pavilion. There were 22 foreign pavilions, and the Chinese was the largest. And they bought 10,000 of those posters. So the quality of it has to be good, too.
You've done another great photo at an event a few years ago that they called the Million Man March.
Oh,
Let's talk
indeed.
about that.
Well,
And how you come to do this great photo. I
Well-
mean, where were you when I saw this picture? I didn't know it was your picture. I saw the picture long before I knew that you were connected with the picture. And I was telling Brother Hadari at Pyramid Books, this photo, this is bad.
well, you know, interestingly, I was standing on the steps for Dr. King when he gave the I Have a Dream speech. I was on the Lincoln Memorial steps, and I photographed that. And this book also has what I think are really, really wonderful photographs of Dr. King and the March. Now, one of them has a photograph of Dr. King doing the prayer just before the I Have a Dream speech. Now, this is the crowd shot of the 1963 March on Washington. But I want you to see...
All of these are your photographs.
All of these are my photographs. Yes, my son, one of my sons contributed some of them. But now this photograph is of Dr. King and Whitney Young and Walter Reuther as they were praying just before the I Have a Dream speech. This was the prayer. And this next one here showing all of these persons lined up. You've got here Ralph Bunch, and you've got
Andy Young.
Bayard Rustin, and you've got even Dr. Benjamin Mays and John Lewis.
I've never seen that.
Well, this even I still get flesh crawling every time I see this photo myself. It's truly historic. Never before, never again, these persons. And that was taken while I was on the steps during the March on Washington. Now, the reason I mention that is that they're in each of these, really what I regard as really sensational, there's a certain quality of feeling one has. I knew that this was a great moment, and my photograph, yes, I knew this was a great moment with Dr. King. Similarly, in that time I mentioned with Arafat, I knew that was a great moment.
You just felt it.
Oh, I knew it was a great moment. I knew also at the Million Man March.
Let's show that.
You want to
so
see
we can
this?
show it, please. Let's
Yeah,
hold
at the
it.
Million Man March, when Minister Farrakhan led these million men into a pledge.
Yes.
And you'll see here at the very top, I pledge that from this day forward I will strive to love my brother as I love myself. Now this is one of the pledges they made. But I knew when they began to do that, even though we photographers had been put down off the stand,
Really?
I said, well, they can put me out after this if they want, but I want to capture those expressions, the sincerity, as well as the mass, and I did so. So I climbed back up on the riser and for that photograph.
But there's a certain spirit, a certain calmness, a certain peace there.
Oh, there
and it's
is.
reflected
And
on the faces.
there's peace and determination as well. There's a spiritual quality about it. There's no question. It is, in fact, it's in the movie Kiss the Girls.
Oh, okay, the new movie.
It is
Okay.
it is on the dormitory wall of the boyfriend of Dr. Cross's niece in the movie. But I wanted very much to get that photograph while these men were taking this pledge. The sincerity, the spirituality, and all were so important.
There were people everywhere, on top of statues,
Oh, listen.
in the trees.
Oh, well, this...
That's why I was wondering, where were you when you were thinking?
Well, it wasn't easy, but as you'll see in that book with the marches, some of them I took from the top of the Washington Monument and some from the top of the Lincoln Memorial. So,
Well, you one of the guys on top of one of the statues one time?
well, no, not on top of one of the statues, but I was on the Lincoln Memorial. I shot some of those photographs from up top there. I must have run about 50 miles that day to get to all the different places.
And Dr. Yeah, you're also columnated. You're also you're columnist. I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm
Syndicated.
independently syndicated in the Richmond Free Press, and the Philadelphia Tribune,
Tennessee Tribune as well.
the Tennessee Tribune, and the Miami Times.
Each week.
Each week, yes. In fact, on my way over this morning, I picked up my mail, and I did for the Richmond Free Press, in addition to my column, I also did a story on the Million Man March. And I began, if I can just read the lead to this, the Million Woman March. Excuse me, thank you, yeah. I said, my lead on this is, the women came, the weather rained, but as usual, the women remained steadfast.
Yeah.
It was truly a remarkable turnout. The weather was awful, and here I do have one of my photographs in here of the Million Women's March. So I might well do a poster on the Million Women's March as well.
It's wonderful.
So I like to chronicle all of these things.
And it's so important that you chronicle these things because it's historic and it's something for